If you're an athlete, you know the greatest motivator of all is the fear of letting your teammates down. After all, a team is only as good as its weakest link. So you owe it to those wearing the same jersey as you to be your best every time you step on the field. That's why there's no vape in team. When you vape, you can expose your lungs to toxic chemicals that can damage your lungs. If you're a step behind, the team's a step behind. Brought to you by The Real Cost and the FDA.
We were in the middle of playing a different game, and he was like, we were playtesting Blades. That was one of our weeknight games, and we were playing, I think it was like the FFG Star Wars game, and there was just this like one point where we were trying to figure out rules about money, and it was kind of a headache. And he was just like, why can't we just make it coin? Why can't this just be blasters in the dark? And so that was the thing we all laughed about, and then we played it next week.
Stras was an amazing guest. He covered so many different aspects of game design, and you can hear how much fun we had. He offers incredible insights on the playtest process and how the playtest process led to him designing games. And make sure you stick around to the end for our discussion of the hobby's current state and the power that comes from making games. The Third Floor Wars patrons make this and every episode possible. I'd like to welcome some of our newest supporters and floorheads. Big thanks goes to Harrigan, John Richardson, Arjun Potsma, George Dubas, Feeling Good Lewis, Andrew Lear, and Nick Sauer. Because of you and the other 100+ patrons, I'm able to bring you content on a weekly basis. All right, sit back, relax, and enjoy my time with Stras.
Do you love to unplug and play games around the table? Greetings, friends and floorheads, to Tabletop Talk from Third Floor Wars. If you love tabletop gaming, you are in the right place. Listen as Craig delivers in-depth discussions and interviews with game designers, creators, insiders, and experts. Learn from the people making and playing the role-playing, miniature, and board games you love.
Howdy friends, Craig here. Today we're talking to Stras Acimovic of Off Guard Games. Stras may be best known for his work on Forged in the Dark games, Scum and Villainy, and the Band of Blades. Both take the ideas of Blades in the Dark, but they take them to completely different universes and different settings with surprisingly different mechanics. So Stras, welcome to the Third Floor.
Hey, thank you for having me.
So I need a little bit of a gaming origin story from you. At one point, you discovered that you could roll dice and have a piece of paper in front of you and pretend to be somebody else. But there was the day before that you had no idea you could do that. So can we go to that day when you first realized what role-playing was?
It's actually a really interesting conversation about like what makes somebody a gamer. Before that, my family, I was actually, my dad used to work for the diplomatic corps. And so we weren't in the States, and I ended up, for Christmas, my parents asked me what I wanted, and one of the things that I saw in a catalog and picked it out amongst piles of clothes and or furniture that my mom was hoping I would be vastly more interested in as a child. Hint, I wasn't. Was an old board game, which you could, if you had video, you would see it on the shelf behind me, called Hero Quest. And
oh, wow.
I really wanted it, but the international shipping was a little wild at the time. And my parents tried to convince me to get anything else. And the bargain that they made was that I could get 2 of something else instead of that. I was like, no. Then they were like, well, if you want that, you're going to have to wait a year. And
wow.
Sure enough, a year later, a very tiny Stras adamantly stood by my decision. And so even though it was expensive, my parents got it for me. And then I was like the popular kid that had the cool game that would bust it out. And we played through every module.
We got to hold on a second here.
All right,
how old were you?
I don't know. I was like...
Guess.
I want to say like 8 or 9.
And you had the commitment. Like at 8 or 9, I couldn't remember a thing for a whole year. And you committed to it for the whole year.
I was very stubborn. I knew what I wanted. Yeah, this is a very long-standing thing between me and my parents.
It didn't end with the Hero Quest?
No, goodness, no.
So you're the cool kid. You've got Hero Quest.
Yeah, actually, well, this is actually super interesting. Is the fact that I mean, all the kids wanted to play Hero Quest, and we played through all the modules. And then when we ran out of modules, I made up new ones. And it's not really an RPG in the sense that like it's written to create emergent narratives and people actually portraying their characters, but it's something that we did as kids. And to me, it basically qualifies as my first RPG. If we want to talk about actual first RPG, I had a friend who had an older brother who had a copy of Warhammer First Edition in French. And that was actually the first role-playing game I ever played. So I learned about niveaux and learned all my elements by their French names. And, this is just, it was a bunch of us younger kids getting to play with a much older kid, which we felt was super cool.
I bet. Well, it's neat when I hear these origin stories. So just so you know, not to make you feel common or anything, but Hero Quest comes up a lot. I'm amazed. And Hero Quest was part of, that was my MacGuffin. So, automatically, 8-year-old Craig is like, God, you're so cool. You had that. Because I never had a copy. I've yet to have a copy. I've played it, but I've never had a copy. And the friend's older brother is another common thing. It's just really funny. And one of the things that I talk about a lot of times with people that are of a generation before us, before me, is that legacy of passing it down. And it's just like there was a older brother passing it down to the kids in the neighborhood thing that was happening. And it's funny that it happened to you. So what was Warhammer First Edition RPG like for you as a kid? Do you remember what that experience was like?
Yeah, actually I do. I often joke that I think it's what actually attracted me to indie gaming. I know that sounds like a weird statement to make, but
such a small IP.
Well, it taught me two things. So you rolled characters and you would get a career, and it didn't care if you particularly cared about it or not.
Yep. And
first character I made was a rat catcher. And I thought it was the worst thing ever. And then I played, and it turned out to be the best thing ever. I had a small but vicious dog. And it ended up saving the party multiple times. And what it taught me was to find joy in the unexpected. And there's another thing about Warhammer that most people don't know, which is that it has a very indie sense of bargaining to it in terms of roles. So if you look at a base character in the early editions, it'll tell you something that's not particularly useful, like your chance to hit someone with a melee weapon is 28% because it used percentile dice. And but that's not true. That's the beginning of the conversation. At that point, you start looking at what are your pluses and minuses. So you'd say but they don't know I'm coming, and I'm also in the dark. So maybe I'm going to get some bonuses here. And all of a sudden it gets into the 60s, the 70s, and so on and so forth. And what it really taught me was fictional position, which is something that we're going to talk about tonight on Blades in the Dark. But it's really interesting because if you take a look at a lot of the more modern adventure games that tend to be played on grids with minis and things like that, a lot of this goes out the window. There's some static +2s that you can apply if you get flanking or whatever. But this core conceit that the percentage that's on your sheet is the beginning of a conversation is something that I think got ingrained in me before I even understood game design. And it just
that's crazy.
Came with me all the way to today. So
yeah, that was a big revelation for me, that concept. And I give John credit for that when I read Blades, because it was one of those things that I kind of understood, but then I saw it written down. And I came from GURPS, right? So when I was a kid growing up, we played GURPS, which is just, you think that 5e is crunchy. That was, everything was leveled out. And then the freedom that conversation gives is amazing. And for you to have that as part of your first introductions is insane. So what's after that? So you play a little bit of, or do you play a little bit or a lot of first edition Warhammer?
It was actually a little bit, just because one of the problems with kids and being part of the diplomatic corps is you move a lot. So did not play a ton of that, but I did end up playing. This is gonna shock nobody. I think I hit D&D 2nd edition first, because that's what a kid at summer camp knew. Sure. And then I reverted to old kind of BX style games, because when I was in high school, one of the teachers who ran the role-playing club, that's the only rule set that he knew. So that's what he ran for us. So I was really kind of swapping systems and learning systems. Like anytime you got to a new place or you got to a new group, you wouldn't just accept that there was a difference in table culture and house rules. There would oftentimes be an entirely new game. And so there was a lot of like expectation that you'd constantly be learning new games. And in high school, actually, the game that kind of blew my mind, the thing that, and we'll talk about this too when we talk about some of my designs, game I played a bunch of was Ars Magica.
Oh, yeah.
And it's a strange game. It has very strong opinions in its design. It's the first time I was introduced to the concept of troop play. Yep. And it's just very, very powerful kind of formative experience for me. Like when I played a bunch of D&D, a lot of what we played was, either pre-canned adventures or adventures the GM would make. And the jump from that to this was quite a leap. And I think that's definitely influenced a lot of what I've been thinking about and playing since. So
I bet. And you know who brought that up immediately too is when I interviewed McGay and Vincent Baker. They talk about Ars Magica a lot as well. So I'd be curious for you, do you think that you picked up an ability to absorb quickly these types of mechanics because of out of necessity as you jumped from game to game and group to group? Is it something that that mechanized your brain, if that makes any sense?
You know what? I don't think so. I think that it's part of all of us. People have a tendency to like the comfortable, but I mean, if you think about it today, there are lots of video games that are very very comfortable. People play a variety of AAA titles that come out every year, and the thing is that even though many of them have elements that they share, they also have vast differences in system. And we are actually pretty well trained, at least in my generation, to approach a new problem set or to look at new game mechanics. It's not a massive iterative leap to go from something like Zelda to Dark Souls. It just has a more exacting, specificity to how you're actually like playing out your moves. So the thing is that I think that in our lives, we frequently do this where we approach new experiences and we absorb new experiences. And I think that there can be some trepidation and fear about departing from, stuff that's comfortable and that you're used to. But I think that we do it all the time. And it's one of the things in my job, but during the day, I'm a programmer. And so like learning new programming languages and brushing up your skill sets and things like that is a very common practice in the job. So I think it's just part and parcel of my life. I don't think that there's something magically special there that makes me unique. There are many people that do this all the time. So I think that it's just something like exploring the new and tasting different things is definitely like a flavor that some people like more than others. You'll definitely find folks that just like the regular thing that they have, and there's nothing wrong with that. And then there's definitely the people that are more like me who just want to have adventures and try different things and eventually find delicious new flavors that they like. So bring it back home, share it with your home group.
So we found out your first game design happened back with HeroQuest when you ran out of modules. But, and a lot of kids did that, right? A lot of kids, created their own dungeons and things like that. But not everybody starts to really tinker with the guts a little bit. So I'd be curious, when did you first start noticing that you wanted to get a little bit deeper than just adding the next adventure and doing another thing? When did you find yourself dissecting things a little bit and experimenting with design in that way?
So I don't know. This is a complicated question, right? Because I think that the line on what makes a designer is blurry. Like, is adding one or two new rules for a dungeon where it's blurry. There was when I was slightly older, I got to be the cool older brother, as it were. My sister and some kids behind our house, I ran some games for them, and they were completely ad hoc. I ran them like out of my head. And the thing is that I couldn't, because like I didn't have like full book sets and I couldn't expect them to read entire compendiums. I would just simplify things, and I would run it a lot more like original D&D style, where they'd tell me what they'd want to do and I'd make some rolls for them. And so I simplified things and broke down tables and did a lot of DIY stuff there, but I didn't really think of it as a game design. I thought of it as just like, I don't know, I'm just running a thing for these people and I need to make it kind of work. I actually didn't jump into design right away. I started working on, I I did a lot of playtesting for a bunch of designers. So if we roll back the clock, maybe 10 years, the thing that I'm really known for is being a playtester in the community. I would be able to pull together a table of people on a moment's notice. I'd be able to read through entire texts and provide feedback, and I'd be able to like test mechanics and say, you know, hey, this is what was working, this is what wasn't working for us. And so that's actually how I got involved with Blades in the Dark eventually. But I wasn't actually looking to be a designer. I think that today we can talk a little bit about keeping people on pedestals and sort of this artificial separation between designers and people who are players and whatnot, which I think is kind of bogus. But it's something that I'm looking at in retrospective. It's a lot harder to see when you're sort of in the midst of things. And so, yeah, I think I started working on the first game that I published. I published some modules. There were a couple of people that actually signed me on board to write like little stretch goal type things. But the first game I published was there's a fellow by the name of Jonathan Walton, who was putting together these. They're called indie mixtapes. They were just like collections of short 2 to 3 page games where Jonathan would help out by doing layout and things like that, and then they would be sold as a bundle, and the money would go as a charity to some designers that were in need for whatever reason. And so I think I put out 2 or 3 very short games, and I think that what really helped me there is what we're seeing a lot in the sort of like itch community today is the fact that there was a very low bar in terms of what was required to put out something that could be called a game. Because I think that everyone is perhaps rightfully scared of putting out a 300-page book because that seems like an impossibly difficult feat. But when somebody says, hey, can you crank out 2 pages worth of thing? The bar's pretty low, and here I'll help you. I'll do some layout. You don't have to learn an entire new skill set on top of game design. And maybe I'll provide an editor or something too. And so like that's just like one of those. It was one of those moments where I was like, yeah, I think I can do that. And so I actually made those with a friend of mine who's currently the other half of Off Guard Games, John LaBeouf Little. And that also helped is the fact that if you have a friend who says, hey, I'll be there with you. Let's get this done. It also helps. So yeah.
Yeah, and I agree with you about the pedestal thing, right? It's very easy for us to kind of create that aura that there's something different and super special about it. But at the same time, making something and finishing it is a big deal.
Yeah, the 80-20 problem where the last 20% takes 80% of the work.
Yeah. And
I'm very familiar.
Yeah, I mean and that's so many people get stuck there. So I don't disagree with you about the pedestal thing, but at the same time, it's okay to be kind of like, shit, I made something.
There's a really cool quote that I heard once, which said that people don't pay for the idea of a game. People pay for the work that it takes to actually finish a game.
That's a great quote.
And I'm very much in agreement about that. There's
you've lived it.
Things. Yeah. I've been through the grinder, and it looks like Sean has convinced me to do it again. So.
Oh, good Lord.
Yeah.
Well, guys, the Insider Insight series is my opportunity to sit down with designers, developers, artists, writers, and creators and learn how they approach their work. I try to understand their process, inspiration, and the methods for crafting their creations. We're going to take a quick break. When we get back from this break, we're going to talk about really the beginnings of things. We're going to talk about introduction to Blades in the Dark and the idea of Forged in the Dark. We'll be right back.
You like science fiction, right? You love playing games, maybe even role-playing games. But what if you can't get your friends together for a game night? If you love games like Mothership or Orbital Blues, check out Dead Belt, a card-based space western solo strategy RPG about skillful and desperate scavengers picking over the remains of junked starships in hopes of a juicy payday. In it, you deal with lurking dangers, push your luck, and walk away with enough cred to keep on flying. Of course, You might get eaten by lurking aliens, or run afoul of rival scavengers, or face the murderous ghosts of long-dead spacers. No one said life in the Dead Belt was going to be easy. For more information on this and all of Sean and Abby Drake's games, swing over to acoupleofdrakes.com. The link's in the show notes.
So we talked about your origin story and finding Hero Quest and kind of when gaming came, part of your life. And I like how you parsed that. But I'm going to do the same thing to you again to be a broken record. So at some point you didn't know about Blades in the Dark, and then suddenly you did. At what point did it get on your radar?
So there was a thought experiment that John Harper did. There was a platform back in the days of yore when dinosaurs roamed the earth, called G+, and a lot of indie designers were on G+, and John Harper posted a thought experiment on how to do position and effect, i.e. Fictional positioning in PBTA games. And I had heard rumors that John Harper was going to be working on this, but at the time, John Harper was one of those, designers whose games I greatly admired, but I didn't know him very well in person. Right. But there is, I mentioned that I had spent a lot of time being a playtester. And so it wasn't the first game. There was a deal where I went to, this is actually kind of an interesting story. I went to Gen Con one year, and it was the year the year after I discovered indie games. And this is when Games on Demand wasn't a big thing. It was still in this tiny room in the back of the train station. And I had been at a table where I knew absolutely nobody. And it was only much later that I found out that this Red Book Dungeon World game was run by, Jason Morningstar. I didn't know who Jason was, and we got murdered by spider goblins or something. I don't even remember exactly what happened. But it was rough. We all TPK'd. We were all laughing. We had a good time. But
and you had good relationships between the characters because it was Morningstar.
Yes. But I tried picking up a copy of the Red Book, and it had all sold out. And so I went to their website, and one of the things that it asked, it said, "Hey, we will give you a PDF of the playtest for free if you promise to run it and write us a little email saying how it goes." And so I did that. I not only did that, but I was like, what a brilliant idea. And then anytime I was interested in a game that was in development, I would just fire off an email and be like, "Hello, creator, you don't know me, but I would really like to play your game, and I will run it, and I will write a report if you can give me a PDF." And
that has tremendous value, though. I'm sure
more often than not, designers were delighted to get a pretty extensive breakdown with photos of happy people playing their game. Funny story. This is also partially how I met John LaBeouf Little. So yeah, I got involved with playtesting Dungeon World, and I was a pretty big part of that community. If you read the 16 Hit Point Dragon, that's the thing that I wrote in response to somebody on the original playtest forums. And Sage Latora, who's one of the designers, is a big part of John Harper's home group. It's a very long-running group with a bunch of really cool people in it. And so Sage recommended me as a playtester to maybe get on board for Blades. So I was one of the earliest external playtests for Blades in the Dark. The game looked nothing at all like it does. And the invitation came out of the blue. I just woke up one morning and it said, "Hey, you've been invited to the Blades in the Dark beta. Would you like to join this group?" And I said, "Yes." So...
please be for a game.
Oh, no. I knew who Harper was. So okay. I definitely, I was like, oh my gosh, Harper knows who I am. So yeah.
Lady Blackbird guy.
Yeah. And so yeah, that was, well, technically at the time it was Danger Patrol guy, but,
oh, nice. Yeah. Good point.
But yeah, I got involved with Blades of the Dark with the playtesting, and I was deeply involved with it. I think I was running groups. I sat down at one point and realized that I'd played like over 40 like different versions of Blades throughout its iterations and kind of career. And so being deeply involved, when the Kickstarter started, Harper was trying to get the people that were part of that community and were playtesting and he felt sort of like involved with and you know, they were a big part of the game. He asked us to try and like, hey, if you could put this out or if you could hack this, what would you do? And that's how I actually got on the hook for Scum and Villainy, Band of Blades, and this game that's not out yet called Throne of the Void. So yeah, that's basically how I got involved with Blades in the Dark.
So I'm not like you. I want to let me know when you're done. Then I'll play your game, right?
Okay,
and I've gotten involved with playtesting with miniature games, not with role playing. I've never been a playtester for role playing games before, and I just found out through time that I just don't enjoy the process, which makes me far less valuable as a playtester, right? Because I think you have to have a certain energy and a certain commitment to be able to present something back in exchange for that. That's obviously not the case for you. So I'd be curious, you know, what is it that made you like doing that so much and obviously was very good at it?
I don't know if it's any specific thing. Like it's not maybe it's a personality trait. Maybe it's the fact that my parents always taught and encouraged critical thinking and analysis. But like anything, like a game design, like I'm about to be controversial, warning, like being a good player. I think that being a good player and being a good designer and being a good playtester is like a muscle. I think it's something that you exercise and you become better at. I definitely think that there are plenty of books that can help you do it. I think that there are fields that are interactive, like looking at art critique and things like that. Learning about that will help you do it. And I think that there is a lot of ways that you can sort of flex those muscles and become better at it. But I think that overall it's a skill. It's something that you practice. I cannot tell you why I liked it initially. Maybe it's the thrill of trying something new and exciting that is it's beyond the cutting edge. It's the bleeding edge. And it's fun. I think there's also like a really good energy about designers that are really excited about their games. And I think that that's part of what became fascinating to me about conventions. I think that conventions have a lot of good energy. I think that you meet a lot of people that share interests and hobbies that are very similar to you. But I think that one of the main reasons I go to conventions is to see all of the designers and hear about the hot new thing that's going to be, you know, coming off the shelf maybe in 2 years. I still remember that, like, when some of these Kickstarters completed, some of my friends are like, well, okay, now you can run this game you've been talking about for like years. And I'm like, I've run over 300 sessions the last 2 years. I'm cooked. You know, yeah, I can't do this no more. And they're like, but it just came out. I'm like, to you, baby. But so there are some drawbacks, you know, caveats.
I'm sure.
But it is definitely a thing that I don't have a pithy canned answer with a good soundbite as to why I love it so much.
Well, I think you helped me understand that a little bit, Stras. So maybe something that would help me a little bit too is to think about you when you first started playtesting to fully baked Stras, becoming a famous and a sought after playtester. Let's talk about that journey a little bit. What did you learn in that process after doing it over and over and over again, and you know, realize possibly, you know, towards the end that you truly bring something to the table?
I think that playtesting and providing feedback is actually frequently one of the first steps in game design. When I first started playtesting, I already had like over a decade of role playing under my belt. So I think that even as young /wee Stras, I would look at games and try to pick out, you know, the bits that worked better or I liked more, and tell people what they should or could be excited about. And I think that playtesting, one of the things that helped me revise is how to condense a session into a feedback report. Because if you, at the time, I know this is weird to talk about, but in the wild lands of 2005, doing video recordings of sessions, which is not a thing that happened. And so today, our experiences are somewhat different. Like having Twitch recordings of your games was just an unthinkable thing 10 years ago. And I kind of went through that era where I played when there was no communication between designer and players, and you had to make best guesses at what somebody intended in a book. You could theoretically write a letter, and if you were very lucky, you could meet someone at a convention. And then it got to the point where I felt pretty confident, and I didn't feel scared to just like email a designer and ask something, because the worst thing that could happen is they wouldn't answer, so who cares? And then we got to the point where you had like almost real-time conversations where you'd leave a comment and somebody would reply within 24 hours on social media. And now we've got like you don't need an older brother, because you can just turn on Twitch and watch 100 different channels play games, and you can learn how to play it however you need to. You don't need to find somebody in your neighborhood to teach you how to play D&D. And so I think that playtesting is also just a continuation of when you first start out, you make homebrew rules for things that work better for your table. And I think that playtesting is just identifying some weak points and maybe what you might do to, revise that. Like that's the first steps. But I think that as you do it over and over again, instead of begging people for a questionnaire and hoping that they get some questions right, you start thinking about the sort of questions that you want to ask. You listen to designers about what was useful feedback and what wasn't, and you start refining sort of how you look at a session and taking it apart and looking at people's impressions, because getting feedback is a very interesting thing. Can I talk about a current game? I know it's
I would love that.
So we just actually got 28 pages of feedback back on Project Perseus, which is a game that we're working on. And it's really interesting because occasionally you get back-to-back pieces of feedback that tell you, like one of them said, hey, this operator role that you invented, this like quasi-GM-like meta role that oversees the spy genre operation, was fantastic. Here's 10 ways that we used it. It was such a thrill. I loved it. And literally the next comment is, we had so much trouble with this role. I don't really understand how it works. Here's some things that we were struggling with. And so when you look at two pieces of feedback like that in a vacuum, you think to yourself, is this good or this is bad? But that's actually the wrong question. One of the things that practicing feedback lets you know is that what you really need to do is write text that creates connective tissue between what group one implicitly understands and what group two was struggling with. So what it helps you learn is what you need to write to help people understand the ideas that you're trying to get across. And I think that that's an interesting way to look at playtesting. Young playtester Stras was certainly much more concerned about mechanics, whereas much more baked playtester Stras is looking at the reasons people say things, because frequently, always their feelings are valid, but what causes them is not always apparent, sort of in the things that they say, and kind of understanding the reasons behind things and how to correct for them is sort of the step maybe between playtesting and design.
So I've been talking to you as a playtester in some sort of bizarre island, which is not the case, because in a lot of ways, a good playtester, and correct me if I'm wrong here, is a funnel and a gatherer and a translator. Those are all skills that I would imagine would make a good playtester. So I guess my next question would be, where did you find people to playtest with? Was it always the same group, or did you have several groups? And were you selective? And did you learn to translate each of them? I'd be curious what that process is like.
So one of the side effects of moving frequently as a kid is that you learn how to find and gather people on short notice. So no, actually, I playtest with a lot of different crews. There are times when occasionally I will have like a party or a board game night or something, and a bunch of people will show up, and I'm the only commonality between a lot of them, because everybody knows me, but nobody knows each other. And it's really funny because I will introduce people to each other as, hey, this is a Wednesday night person and this is a Tuesday night person, right? And so like they'll understand which group they're a part of, like implicitly. They're like, oh, you're the folks playtesting X.
They've got the strings in their head going from the tax.
Exactly. Like, so it's just one of those things. It's wherever I move, I very quickly find people. I think this is also partially why I don't have a lot of fear going to conventions. I can just sit down at a table with a bunch of strangers and walk out of it with friends that I'm going to play games with the next day.
That's cool.
It's I definitely agree with you, but it's definitely not one group. I do have a home group that this is my Wednesday night group. It's the same group I've been playing with for years now, but almost every other group I play with is either ad hoc or just for the length of a specific campaign or project. This is not because I dislike any of my friends. It's just because adult lives have a tendency to fluctuate, right? Like people have to buy houses, they have children, they move, jobs change. So which nights of the week you're free change. And so I try to make sure that people understand what sort of commitment I'm expecting. And then I do not expect them to adhere to some sort of long-standing every Friday night for the next 30 years, put it on your calendar kind of thing.
No contracts are signed.
Yeah, no.
So your Wednesday night group, is that a opportunity for you just to play, or have you subjected them to play testing and put them through this process?
Oh, it's pretty much just play testing, to be real with you. But here's the secret. If you design with a partner, you get to play a bunch. So, for example, I'm in this Perseus game that I'm talking about. John LaBeouf Little's running it Wednesday nights, and I'm observing people's reactions and writing a lot of notes and doing a lot of design behind the scenes. But I'm actually a player in the game, so we definitely swap chairs a lot. So it's a mix. Sometimes I play, sometimes I run. Harkening back to the days of Ars Magica, I think that I hold on loosely. I don't feel the need to own a game, so I have no problem passing it off for somebody else to run. As a matter of fact, just on a sequence of bad dice rolls, somebody died in my Sunday morning game, and one of the I was talking to them afterwards, and I was like, "Hey, what do you want to play next?" And they're like, we're not feeling anything right now, but and I was like, "Well, do you want to run?" And they were like, "Can I?" And I was like, "Yeah, of course." And so like I have a character there now, and I'm having a blast, and somebody else is running. So so it's for me, a lot of that is very fluid. Like I don't have this control of a world where I have to have all my fingers dug in. I love sharing notes because one of the hallmarks, one of the things that I really like about Forged in the Dark and PBTA is the fact that even as the GM, even when you do prep and you have, threats and fronts and factions and all that stuff, you still don't know exactly what's going to happen. So I'm not somebody who's basically written a novel and is just running people through it. I'm very much excited to show up and see what the people do because I can't possibly predict it. So I do my prep, but I can hand that prep off to someone, and I guarantee you me playing is going to change what the game's going to look like just as much as them playing was going to change what I was going to see that weekend. And so it helps with this conceit of not trying to like hold on to this multi-year campaign that you've outlined very, very carefully, and therefore I can just swap places pretty easily.
Yeah. So I'd be curious, when you're at the table with your partner and you guys are, playtesting either your game or maybe, goofing around with another game that you've come across, how often are the observations different depending on who's playing and who's running? I'd be curious to know, like, do you walk away from that playtest and, he says, this is what I saw. And you're like, nah, that's not what happened. Let me tell you what I saw. I'd be curious what that conversation's like.
Happens more often than you'd think, but not all the time. There are plenty of times where I'm like, did you see that? And John will just be like, oh yeah. And so, we joke that we're drift compatible. It's a little Pacific Rim gag that we have, but, that happens, because among other things, a GM has a different perspective on a game. There's a difference between being a director and being an actor. And I think that, it also takes a lot of attention to sort of keep everything together, keep painting the colors, doing all of these other things. And sometimes you can miss a thing. And so like later on, it's something that I bring up and you'll hear the like, oh yeah, that did happen. Because I have time to like take notes, right? And pay attention to specificities. Whereas a lot of times the GM is involved in all the scenes and all the conversations. And so, so that's a way that we sometimes have a difference, not because, it's a drastically different observation, but sometimes our observations are different. We draw different conclusions from the same thing we saw. And usually we resolve that by just like talking it out. And sometimes, we say like, okay, well, if it's X, then how would we change it? If it's Y, how would we change it? And then we do an A/B test. Sometimes we'll put out two versions of the same thing, or we'll try the same thing again to see if we get a reliable reaction. Both of us are scientists.
I was about to say, it's shockingly systematic. I love it.
Yeah, I don't want to make it sound like our players are guinea pigs. They're absolutely volunteers, and I promise that it's a true game and they're having a good time. But
I don't want to play anymore.
well, actually, one of the things that John and I do, this is actually super interesting, is that a lot of times we will look at certain statistics or make certain assumptions that will allow us to run through segments of our game with automation, where we're like, so for example, in Band of Blades, we actually had this like sequence of charts that allow us to play through a like a mission and see sort of what the outcomes are. So a lot of times when we're testing sort of the campaign rules, we skip through actually playing the sessions, and we'll play an entire campaign in a sitting and just check and see if our numbers are matching up and like whether we can replicate certain things. So we are very scientific in our approaches. Both of us are programmers, so like that's a thing that'll sometimes shine through.
Well, and I realized that we missed something here, which is, how did you and John meet, and how did, like, well, when did the two of you become a thing?
So John was actually part of a different design group out here in Colorado, and they had put out a game called Becoming Heroes. In that same back room of the train station at Gen Con, I was standing by the whiteboard because if you didn't have a full group, you could just kind of chill and people would show up and go to sit down and play. And if they had a table of like 2 to 3 people, you could be like, hey, the game that you're playing sounds really awesome. If you want to play by yourself, that's cool, but would you mind an extra player? And you could just do that. And that's how you would meet people. And so John showed up with, at the time, I didn't realize it, but it was a bunch of luminaries, and I couldn't recognize anyone by sight at the time. So John showed up and he asked me if I was interested in playing the Becoming Heroes. And I was like, well, tell me about your game. And he started this tirade about the cycle of heroics and all this other very kind of high level design language. I was like, no. I'm asking like this session, what it's specifically about. And he just looked at me and went like, oh, it's a Doctor Who scenario. And I was like, oh, all right, let's do it. And so I sat down, and out of respect for the fact that there was this group of people already with me, I let everybody else pick their characters first. And so I picked up the last sheet of paper and I flip it over and I go, I guess I'm the doctor.
Nice.
And John just looks at me out of the corner of his eye and goes, you're the doctor? And he like reaches into his backpack and pulls out a sonic screwdriver and a piece of psychic paper and puts it in front of me. And I was like, oh, all right, it's on.
I like you.
So I ripped that up. I chewed scenery. I had a really good time. And the next day I went down to the floor and I found their little booth and I bought their game, and we got to emailing each other. And this is actually that whole email protocol. I went home and of course I told my friends about all the highlights of the Gen Con trip, including the Doctor Who scenario. And so there's another friend of mine who would run a small house con once a year in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And I wanted to run a Becoming Heroes scenario because I kind of love the game. But what I realized is that making the scenarios was actually kind of tricky. So I emailed them and I was like, hey, do you have another adventure? And John was like, no, but I'll make one for you. What do you like? And I was like, giant robots? And the next day I got this zip file labeled Starburst, 3 exclamation marks.
How funny is that?
And so I wrote up like a 5-page, play report feedback form. And we got to talking and we got to hanging out the next year at Gen Con. And after that, we just started. So at the end of that second Gen Con, of course, we had planned to play like 20 games together. And John was like, there's so many games we haven't played yet. And I just kind of laughed and I said, well, I guess you'll have to invite me to Colorado. And then 2 weeks later, I got the invite. And so
that's awesome.
John put together a little house con in Colorado. I flew out. I got to be friends with everyone here. And yeah, we've just been kind of design buddies ever since. When my job shifted, I don't know, it's like 8-9 years ago at this point, I actually moved out here. And so that's when we started designing games together. So he's my best friend. He's an excellent game designer, and it's just really fun working with him. That's cool.
So when I talk to people that work in a partnership, what I often hear about is the concentric circles and then the overlap Venn diagram. So there's certain things that, you're very good at, certain things that he's very good at, and there's the overlap. Do you have a sense of that mapping?
Oh, goodness, yes. Yeah. I tend to have I'm a lot better at sussing out corner cases, and I'm definitely a lot better at kind of interpreting how I'm usually the first pass on mechanics and world building. A lot of times, like, I will write down something about world building, and then John will question me, and through the dialogue, like, he'll say, well, how does this work? Or it's like, well, this is fascinating, but you don't have a lot of information on this. What's this about? And then he'll say, well, that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. And we'll talk it through, right? And then that'll become canon. And so there are certain things that I do really, really, really well. The majority of our books are actually written by John.
No kidding.
I tend to write all of our examples because this goes back to the corner case scenario where I try to showcase the mechanics. So, and there are certain rules that I write because I'm very particular about language in them. But the majority of the flow and the advice and things like that comes from John. I think that he is definitely very good at explaining certain things. Like I'm much more technically oriented in some ways, and the other thing that I learned is I listen to him almost implicitly. It's really funny because there are certain times where I prefer rule sets that are very stripped down. I don't like wasting a lot of time with additional fluff and sort of like going through things very long-windedly. So I like authors that have a very brief and to the point sort of writing style. But unfortunately, that also means that there's a lot of the gaming population that just needs a little more context. This is not a slam. It's just, to me, I can make the leaps of intuition. So if you actually make them for me, I get kind of annoyed. But that's not the truth of most people who play games. And so John's really good at understanding sort of like what's necessary to teach a game. I joke frequently that whenever I write a game, the first thing I do is I write the GM chapter, and I only put one line in it, and I say, just run it like Stras. And it stays that way for a very long period of time.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we do in our design that I think is super showing is that once I've run a game a couple of times, like John and I will both work on the rules, so it's not like, you know, he doesn't understand them. But when we flip seats and he runs it, he'll run into questions that he doesn't know how to answer that I'm filling in with intuition, or I know how it's supposed to work, but I never wrote it down.
Right.
And so it's really interesting because our first pass at the text a lot of times reflects the things that are just assumptions, and he really figures it out and nails it down and writes it down.
That's valuable.
So it's a blast. Also having a person that, you know, you meet with every week means that you usually get something done every week because, you know that Friday or Monday or whatever is coming around and you got to have it done.
Got to get your shit going.
Yeah. So accountability is kind of awesome in having a partner. And yeah, there's definitely times I have a problem as a GM sometimes where it's like the GM's version or the game designer's version of the Tsigi principle. So Paul Tsigi wrote that a player should not create both their obstacle and the solution to the obstacle because it's unsatisfying. It's a game design principle I've very much found to be true for myself at the very least. But John, he will oftentimes make like tables and stuff in our games because like, if I create the lists of obstacles, I won't always find them very like enthusiastically charging, like they don't make my brain explode with ideas, but so he'll fill in our tables with a bunch of ideas, and it's really interesting because sometimes like, you know, he'll make a list of 12 and I have a very good sense of what fits, like I can kind of feel the flow. So sometimes it might be like these 10 are brilliant, but this one's off, and like we should switch this one up, so I'll delete it and we'll put something else in. And so but yeah, he does a lot of our charts and stuff. It's just we definitely fill in each other's gaps and strengths. I think that we definitely have things that we are stronger at. He is definitely better at sort of like symbolism and sort of like large scale stuff and writing things with really solid feelings and explaining things really well. And I think that some of my strengths are more in the like mechanical ends of things and like figuring out systems and abstractions that'll work. And I think that both of us have like a lot of respect for each other and a lot of like practice and working together. So let me tell you, doing a book and when you're staying up till 3 a.m. the like fourth or fifth night in a row, it really makes sure that you're friends, because that friendship doesn't survive otherwise.
Well, you have done what a perfect lead into my next question. So I'm watching the montage of the John and Stras design show, right? And I'm seeing, yeah, this is happening. Yeah, that's a great idea. But then I get to the scene where the two of you butt heads. And I'd be curious, what do you think might be happening there? So when the two of you, obviously you sort through it because you're partners and you work well together, but I would imagine, and the answer might be, Craig, it never happens, but it happens. When you two butt heads, what does it tend to be around?
Stupid stuff is really what it comes down to. We never argue about the big things. We only argue about the little things. I will tell you that editing in text can sometimes get really, really tense because I have certain things that I want to say certain ways, and John is much more of a stickler for things like grammar and whatnot, and I'm just like, that goes out the door when it comes to design.
You're not getting the feeling across.
Yeah, actually, that's some of it. But we tend to when we do argue, it tends to be about little things. When we do argue about bigger stuff, a lot of times what happens is if we cannot come up with a solution, we frequently say, all right, we have to test this, and we'll come up with two separate tests to give it a go, and both of us just agree to abide by the outcomes. That's awesome. That's one of the ways that we handle it. The other thing is that there are certain projects, this happens very, very rarely. I think it's happened like 3 times total, but there are certain projects that like one of us has slightly more ownership over. Like Band of Blades was my baby, so there was like 1 or 2 things where I basically like I was like, I have to push for this, like and those are the words that I use. I'm just like, hey, look, this is kind of my baby and I really want this. Like, is this like a deal breaker? Like, are you like, no, this has to be changed or I'm off the project, or can we just roll with it and you got to trust me for a little bit?
Yeah.
And so like sometimes very, very, very rarely that's a thing that sometimes comes up. But yeah, I mean, most of our arguments, like I said, is about little things. It's
Oxford commas, things like that.
No, actually, I accept Oxford commas, but I it's just I have a tendency to John jokes that I capitalize like a German, so like. How
do I know exactly what that means?
Right. It's like words with extra meaning are oftentimes capitalized in my texts, which is a thing that you'll find in like fantasy novels in my games.
Oh, that's fantastic.
But it's really funny because it drives our editors up a wall, and I'm very adamant about it. And so there's this running gag. So the thing is, the way that we deal with it is we come up with jokes, and we have certain things that we do all the time. So like there was one point where like I accidentally capitalized something correctly, and John tried explaining the grammatical rule about proper nouns. So now when I do a thing that I absolutely know is not a proper noun, he says, "Why did you capitalize this?" I say, "Proper noun," and it causes both of us to laugh.
Oh, that's great.
But I mean, you gotta come up with tricks, especially when this is it's a process that's about like stamina. Like you've got to like sort of go through it, and it's not trivial. And oftentimes, even if you could do it over some extended period of time, there's deadlines and book publications that are beholden to things like Gen Con, and the clock waits for nobody. So, so a lot of times it's you just figure out how to survive the trenches together.
Well, and we got to get through this, right? So let's figure it out and let's get through it. And obviously, and I can hear it as you're discussing this. There's a mutual respect. There's a mutual admiration and recognition, and that gets you a long way and allows you to be able to say, hey, John, this is my baby, so just trust me, and he could ride with it, and vice versa. That's cool.
And it's definitely something where like we have to sit down and actually take a look at how much of a deal breaker it is and whatnot. And it goes back to that idea of flex. Like, you can't hold on too hard. It's just sometimes something is important, and sometimes you can vocalize the whys, and sometimes it's a lot harder to understand. This is a skill that John has that's really, really good, is sometimes I can tell you that I like or don't like something, but it's a feeling that comes up from my gut. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that he's really skilled at is picking out what might bother me about it. John comes from a family that has a lot of artists in it, so this goes back to the field of art critique. And there are times when we commission art and I'll tell him, like, I don't like it. And he can't go back to the artist and say, like, I don't know, just do something different, right? Like, Michaela was amazing to work with. Usually I would put like 3 lines down, and somehow from those 3 lines, she would get exactly what I meant. But every once in a while, very, very rarely, like maybe like 1 in 15 or 20 pieces, there would be something off. And sometimes I would be able to vocalize immediately exactly what it was. And sometimes I would just say, this is wrong. And John would be able to tell me why I thought it was wrong by asking really strange questions. Like, he's like, well, can you pick out an image that you think might work? And he's like, I know that the characters are very wrong, but like a pose. And like, then he would be like, I see. So what you're actually looking at is a position of strength, because the way the camera is shooting this, and he would break it down and I would be like, oh, that's cool. And then I would get language so that the next time something like that came up, I could actually, defend what I was saying and why I was saying, like, a lot more clearly and succinctly. So.
Well, and learning that language at a meta sense is huge, right? To be able to have that conversation with any artist. But I would also imagine it's important to have with individual artists, where you have your own language and you use one language with artist A and another one with artist B. And that has got to be a process as well. All right. So, guys, we're going to take another quick break. When we get back from this break, we're going to start talking about actual games that are being made. I want to talk about Scum and Villainy. We'll be right back.
This is Sean. You may have heard of me from such movies as Brett and Sean Go to Illinois, 2 Motorcycles, 1 Stick of Dynamite, and Gaming and BS. What kind of RPG podcast is that? After my NFTs were stolen, I decided to become a patron of Third Floor Wars. The content is great and it costs me less than a good shot of liquor. So consider becoming a patron. It may just land you your next big role. Head over to patreon.com/Third Floor Wars. Tell Craig Sean sent you.
So you're playtesting, you're working on the progression, and you start to see Blades in the Dark start to form and start to develop. When is the first time the hack comes into play? So it sounds like there was a reach out to say, who has an interest in hacking this? What happens in your brain?
Actually, it was, so speaking of the fellow who had the once a year house con in Pittsburgh, we were in the middle of playing a different game, and he was like, we were playtesting Blades. That was one of our weeknight games, and we were playing, I think it was like the FFG Star Wars game. And there's just this like one point where we were trying to figure out rules about money, and it was kind of a headache. And he was just like, why can't we just make it coin? Why can't this just be blasters in the dark? And so that was the thing we all laughed about. And then we played it next week, because that's how I work.
Don't say it out loud.
Well, yeah. And so I, the name Scum and Villainy was actually, it was a last minute joke. And I've got some flack for it. Because what happened is when John asked for like the emails, it was like in the 11th hour. It was like late some evening. We had like a limited number of hours to submit pitches. And so, I basically just went to a bunch of my gaming friends and I was like, if there was a, Blades in the Dark hack for like space opera, what would it be called? And somebody said Scum and Villainy, and it was supposed to be a working title. It wasn't supposed to be like the real thing. And then it just kind of got glued on. And then I tried changing it, but people would just be like, what are you talking about? Are you talking about Scum and Villainy? And I was like, okay, I'm kind of stuck with this. And it's really funny because I've actually had some big name comic authors on the internet make fun of me for the fact that this name was stuck to the game.
What's the basis of the critique of that, though?
Oh, they just said that I believe the exact words were, we will not play this game because this title is so unoriginal that anything inside this book couldn't possibly be original either. And I was like,
Lord,
ouch, but okay.
Yeah, okay.
Well, actually, it's really funny. I am now on better terms with said person, and I'm actually playtesting a game, and they've played it since. So it's just one of those things. Like, you can't. It's really funny. They said this online. The first thing that happened is we made 75 sales. Like,
That's funny.
you can't take it too personally, right? Like, and no publicity is bad publicity.
If you want to shit on it some more, that'd be great.
So, but like, yeah, it was really funny because I was following them for their comic work and I saw it literally like seconds after they posted. I was like, ouch, but acceptable. I guess that's a critique. I can't take it too personally though, because clearly I haven't read the game. So it's not that you think the game is bad. And they were like, oh, and I was like, it's all right. Don't worry. I'm not that mad. So, it's one of those things. It's like, when you put out a work, there's going to be people that love it. There's going to be people that don't get it. And then there's going to be people that rant about it on the internet. This is just a fact of our existence now. And,
I keep hearing that you have to build up a certain level of internet armor.
Yeah, I think so. And so, this is one of the things that I tell game designers is make games that you want to play or you want to run. More importantly, you want to run. Because if you don't, playtesting is going to be a bear and you're going to hate having conversations afterwards about it. And so I happen to be blessed by the fact that I like a lot of very kind of center mass mainstream nerdy things. So a lot of the games that I make are for me, but it just so happens that a lot of other people happen to like them too.
Well, that was going to be my next question, Stras. So you talk about, playing FFG Star Wars or some version of Star Wars. And then, this came about, as kind of a joke conversation. Now I've designed a game for the next week. Were you a space opera fan before that?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So it wasn't that you just happened to be playing that and that's what led to this.
No. But I mean, at the same time, 2 weeks before that, I had never considered making a space opera game per se. I was just like, I don't know, this one's on the shelf. I'll buy this one. Let's play that. And we did. We had a good time. It wasn't bad. It's just one of my critiques, and I've said this in public, is that it doesn't explain how like it doesn't tell you how much money to give people for stuff, and it was really funny because like the fact that people needed credits also meant that they were engaging in behaviors that were not very movie-like, looting stuff and whatnot. And I was like, okay, this seems to have the wrong incentives. So like, it was just something that we did because people were familiar with A, and some people were struggling with some of the mechanics of B, including the GM. And so making the transition was kind of like, this is a natural step for a lot of game designers, is like, you just put together a thing for your Tuesday night group or whatever. And the thing is that if everybody at the table kind of knows what you're talking about, you don't actually have to write like a 30-page thing. You just write the minimum necessary to put it on the table. And
you're there, right? You're there to show them the game and to walk through it and iterate on the spot too, I would imagine, as you're going through that. So if I were to break into your house and find your notes for that original version that came back on week 1, and then open up my copy of Scum and Villainy, what would I see that it was not changed? What was there from the very beginning?
Some of the playbooks have been around the whole time, like the Scoundrel, the Muscle, right? Because like the Scoundrel is a very standard captain of a starship, whether you're Gene Starwind from Outlaw Star, or you're Captain Mal from Firefly, or you're Han Solo. Like these are very standard archetypes, and sort of like the big, silent, beefy brawler type. Whether you're a deadly robot or a fuzzy alien or whatever is also another kind of archetype. So like a bunch of the archetypes stayed pretty locked in from the get-go. But almost everything else changed. One of the things that we realized early on in terms of our design is that we couldn't do cruise blade style, so we switched to ships, and that was kind of a thing.
So just incidentally, that's when you hooked me. So when I got my copy of it, I was flipping through it, and I was pretty new to blades at the time, right? So there's a whole series of discovery. I find blades, and I realize there's all this hack shit out there. I'm like, I love Star Wars, so I'm going to get that. And I was flipping through it, and I was like, oh, instead of cruise their ships, I'm in. And I remember flipping through it, so I'm glad you pointed that out. But that was solving a problem, right?
More than that, I think that if you watch any sort of behind the scenes footage on literally every show, the producers will talk about how the ship is the additional character, right? Like, and almost every show is either named after the ship or the ship features prominently.
Good point.
Like, the Bebop is for Cowboy Bebop, it's like the Galactica is part of Battlestar Galactica, right? Like, so like it's just one of those things. Is like the ship is either the title of the show, or it's a very, very major component, right? Like Farscape is not called Moya, but
I know what you're saying, though. Yeah.
I think that if you're doing any sort of genre emulation, even if the goal isn't genre emulation itself, in order to be authentic and help people sort of portray that, you have to look at it. And that's actually a question I get asked about Scum and Villainy a lot, is there's a bunch of people who are like, well, why can't I run a space crime army? And I was like, well, what show is that? Because I haven't seen it. Like, it's always the spunky band of like 7 or so. So you got to kind of look at sort of like your inspirations, and you have to be either authentic to them or find the thing that's interesting about that, which I think Scum and Villainy very much plays into the sort of heroic angle a little bit more than Blades. I think that Blades tends to be a lot more gritty, and I think that Scum and Villainy, it's easier to have that scoundrel with a heart of gold motif. Definitely easier to play a more heroic game, because among other things, even though you're in a society that is kind of highly corrupt, you're still fighting against sort of like larger ideas and for larger ideas, I think, maybe. But yeah, it's the whole idea is focused on a slightly more influential angle in a certain way. Blades tends to start with a conceit that the city is bigger than you are, and even though that's true in Scum and Villainy, a lot of times Scum and Villainy games end with the crew making a big difference and changing the universe in some way. It's a meaningful way.
Well, and to your point, it's the touchstones, right? It's what we're familiar with. It's the language we're familiar with. And it's this implicit like promise that you're making, saying, hey, this is what my game's about. And if you come here, this is what it's going to look and feel like. And if I come in there and I start playing Scum and Villainy, it starts feeling like Duskfall, and be like, nah, this is not what I signed up for. I'm just going to go play Blades.
But apparently there's a lot of people that wanted that. It's actually shocking. But I think that it's important to understand something. There are a lot of people that want to make like the game for everybody, and I don't know that that's possible, and much less healthy. I tend to have opinions, and I tend to state them boldly. I'm like, this is what this game is about, and it's not going to be for everyone. And I think that Scum and Villainy in particular has a lot of touchstones amongst a bunch of different genres of sci-fi and space opera, so it has a bit more variance. But like, you can see this a lot more clearly in Band of Blades, where it very much goes for a very specific audience, and they will love it, but it's not a game for everyone. And so I think that with Scum and Villainy, I definitely have an opinion of what I want out of my space opera and why. And I think that hopefully that comes across in the game.
Do you remember the point, Stras, where you've said to yourself, this is done? Like, was there a night? Was there a change?
Yep.
Tell me about that.
It was final_final. The file.
.pdf.
It was really funny because the next thing that I said, I still remember shipping off the files, and we were incredibly drained. And I told John, I said, the files are done, and you have one job left. He said, what's that? And I was like, get reservations at a restaurant so that we can stuff our faces full of food and just celebrate being done. So, but that's also actually a lie, because the moment it goes out, someone's going to notice a typo, and then your project manager's going to be like, well, do you think you could change this in the PDF? And there's still lots of things to do afterwards,
I guess what I'm trying to fish for, Strash, is like, when is a pencil down moment? And let's use Scum and Villainy in particular, where you finally said, look, we're done. And was it a, we have to stop situation, or was a ha-ha situation?
Well, there's stages, right? I think that we had the rules locked in before. So funny fact, Scum and Villainy was a stretch goal for Blades in the Dark. And today, a lot of creators will go to Kickstarter and get funding for their projects and whatnot. But because that was the case, we promised everybody a PDF, and John and I were working on it. And one of the things that John was like, oh, I just really want to have this thing that we've put so much effort in my hands. Like, I want it to be real. And literally, we were flying out and we were talking on the plane when I said to him, I said, John, you have to kind of kill that dream in your heart. Because we asked a couple of our friends and no one's going to publish it. And I don't want to ship things from my living room. So I was like, we will never have this game. And literally the next day, we're sitting at lunch with Sean. And Sean is like, if we'll like to make you an offer to publish Scum and Villainy. And John just looked at me real smugly. And I was like, yeah, I was wrong. So, it's one of those moments where we just both started laughing, and
I bet
the other people at the lunch were looking at us. And so so I think that there's like stages of done, right? Like there's the done when you push, your playtest packet, and then you realize you have to write the book, and then there's the day when the text is done, then you start the layout, then the layout's done, then you have to do the editing, then the editing's done. There's a whole bunch of dones. And so it's kind of hard. Like, I mean, I have to, there's a certain point where you just like push publish, like you send the email in, you're like, here is the final file, please approve. And when they say approved, you're like, okay, now we're done. And so for me, that moment was actually the day when we got, it wasn't the day I pushed the files. I actually think I lied to you about that very slightly. It was like in the next day or two when Fred approved sending it to the printer, because like once it goes to the printer, it's out of my hands and I can't change it anymore. So even if I wanted to, it's finished. So it's one of those things. So like that's a milestone for me. Like when it goes to print, it's as you say, like ship it, or you've got your print cut off in newspapers and whatnot. So at that point you're done. But until that moment, even it's really funny for Blades. John had a print deadline, and less than 48 hours before that, he still made large like mechanical changes, and Sean sent it to me, and I was like, this is going to have the following effects. And then like some of the stuff stayed and some of the stuff changed. God, and it was wild because like he was making major revisions, like literally like
stressing
24
you
hours. Well, it's not me. Like, Sean was super stressed. But like, I was like, look, I'm here to advise. I know it's 2 a.m., but this is how it goes.
Make it stop. But
yeah, for us, yeah, it's hard to if I have to pick a done moment, it's the moment it goes to print.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I'd be curious, was this the first time that you opened up a cardboard box and saw a pile of a book you made?
Yes, absolutely.
And what was that moment like?
It's hard to explain because I respect PDFs 100%. As a matter of fact, the majority of games I run is from PDF. So like, I don't have some sort of judgment about the physical being real. But the moment you hold it in your hands, it is somehow more real. Mm-hmm. And I can't, there's nothing I can say to explain it until you write a thing and you've put so many countless hours that it's this concept that you've kind of transformed, and you go through all sorts of feelings where like, you love it, and then it's 3 a.m. the sixth night in a row, and
I don't want to see it again.
Yeah, exactly. And then when it shows up, there's usually a gap because it like takes like a month or two for print and shipping and all sorts of other stuff. And so like when it shows up, it really is something. It's kind of a magical moment. And the other magical moment is if you ever get a translation of your game, seeing the same game in a different language is wild.
I bet.
Especially if you put them next to each other on the shelf, it's kind of a thing. So because they look the same, except like sometimes like they're clearly not. So yeah, it's that's pretty awesome too. But yeah,
oh, that's cool. So you've play tested, you go through iterations, you finally hit publish, you get the box of books back. Holy shit, like I made a thing and it's printed and I'm holding it right now. Then it goes out in the wild, outside of your control, to tables that you didn't send notes to say, this is how I wanted you to try it this week because we're trying something out. What was it like when you first started getting the wave back, right? So you put this thing out there and it starts coming back.
It's not how it works for us. One of the things that I picked up, I don't know if this was just like a technique that the Forge started or if games shifted, but all of the designers I admired would design in the wild. So your playtests would be out way before your book was. Got it. Which means that the first waves are from your, playtest kits, and you've already gotten dozens of iterations of feedback. You've updated rules left and right. You've argued with fans on the internet, and then they've explained why something is confusing to them and whatnot. And it's just, it's one of those things. Like you've already been in this process for so long that the additional people writing is not actually that huge a change. What does happen is occasionally you see people you didn't expect pick it up. So Scum and Villainy, for example, when it came out, it did okay. Like, it wasn't like doing poorly, but we had a jump. Friends at the Table picked it up, which is a very big, popular actual play podcast. And Austin Walker GMs, and he took Scum and Villainy and made it a season of one of their shows. And the moment that episode hit, we sold in 1 month what we had sold a year before that.
Wow.
Yeah, it's huge. So like, that was a thing I didn't expect, is people that you sometimes see on YouTube videos or getting interviewed suddenly talking about your thing. That's a shock.
Yeah.
I like I said, comic book artists I had followed for years suddenly having an opinion. That I didn't expect to happen. That's weird. And kind of cool, but definitely weird. So yeah, it's and sometimes it's actually kind of fun. Can I share a real funny story?
No.
Okay. I'll take it
Please.
back. Okay, of course. It's interesting because there is sometimes there's the product which takes on a life of its own, and people do some stuff with it. Like, you will not. I keep somebody posted this on Twitter. They don't know me. And I don't actually know them. It was something that came across my feed because somebody shared it. But apparently a group of friends had played Scum and Villainy for the better part of a year, and it meant a lot to them. And so what they did was they cosplayed in character, and they went to a Ren fair and pretended that they were landing on some like planet that was,
how insane
you know,
is that?
And they took photos. And I keep this because it shows me that somebody who is not my friend loved it so much that they did this thing. Like that's actually my goal. I don't actually care about the big name reviewers. I don't care about the big name names. I do care that at least one person really gets it and means so much to them that it like affects their life. And like, that's all a designer, or at least that's what this designer really wants. And so the other thing that's really fun is there's a lot of people that don't know who you are, and they'll talk about your game right in front of you and tell you about it. One of my favorite moments is I walked into an elevator at a convention, and there's a guy standing there holding a stack of like 8 Scum and Villainy books. And I look at it and I go, Scum and Villainy, nice choice. And everybody else in the elevator knows who I am except for this person. And he's like, oh, have you heard of it? I really like it. I ran it. And so I don't live in the States, and I want to bring back some books for all of the people that want it.
Oh my God,
you know?
how cool is that?
And I was like, oh, that's super cool. And he's like, do you know the game? And I was like, oh yeah, I worked on it. He goes, what did you do? And I just look at him point blank and I go, layout. And then I walk off the elevator. So,
I picked the font.
which is true, but
oh, that's cool. But I would imagine, just, and I have a small microcosm of this, so it doesn't compare, but like finding out that somebody played your freaking game for a year and a half.
Yeah.
Like my only version of this, and it's not comparable, but like I'll get messages that say, hey, when is the next episode of this actual play coming out? And I'm like, I can't believe you give a shit. Like, I can't believe that like you're anxious to find out when the next episode is coming out, because I think it's garbage, but I love that you love it. Like but to have somebody with a stack of books like that is a big deal. Or to find out, yeah, we've been playing Scum and Villainy for 2 years. That's just gotta be.
Yeah, it's kind of shocking.
Yeah.
There's things that you don't anticipate ever from game design. I got this weird email when we put out Band of Blades. Wait, are we allowed to talk about Band of Blades?
We
or do we have to talk about? Okay, so we put out Band of Blades, and I got this email from an Australian teacher, which just said, "Hey, so I'm planning to run this for 40 people," and I was like, "It's designed for 4," and. There's a certain point where you're like, look, you're outside of the fence posts, I will try and tell you things that you can anticipate as problems, but
it's on you now.
Godspeed. You are beyond the veil. I have nothing to support you here. But one of the things that she wanted to do was she wanted to break up her classrooms into squads and do a bunch of stuff like that. And so I talked to her. I was like, here's how your resources are going to change. Here's some stuff that you can anticipate as problems. Here's things you can do to compensate for that. And I didn't hear anything for a while, and I just assumed it's sometimes you get an email from someone who's just like, I'm thinking of hacking your game to do this thing, and you never hear about it again.
Right.
And it's not that, I'm not judging anyone. It's just that happens.
That's more often than not, that's what happens. Yeah.
And so I didn't hear about this. And then she sent me the dissertation that she wrote for the Board of Education on the experience. And apparently she was teaching like children that struggled, like they were non-functional in regular classrooms. And
you're blowing my mind right now.
This experience changed them completely. Like they had a kid that wasn't allowed to be alone with anyone else because apparently they were extremely like rude and abusive. Like they would call people names and everything. And she caught him helping somebody do their dishes. And when she asked him why, this kid said, because I'm a Barton and we help our friend, like we get +1D when we help our friends and things like that. And you're reading about like, and it's not one thing because like, I don't actually know the names of any of these kids. They're coded. It's got like substitutions for names and whatnot. It's a technical research paper with like coding and observations. But to understand that you have affected the lives of 40 people is just mind blowing. It makes you, well, like for weeks I wandered around like I was made of titanium, like I was bulletproof because like it doesn't matter
Stras,
if
I'm getting emotional and I didn't make the game.
Yeah, it's wild because we don't understand even necessarily how much some of this stuff can affect people. And hearing about how some of these kids that were nonverbal now are running games for their friends
That's incredible.
If I do nothing else in my life, I feel like I've accomplished something. And I mean, that's like a weird thing to say on a podcast about role-playing games, which are generally considered this fringe hobby that not even the majority of the population knows about. And it's, I don't know, it's a powerful experience. It's
something
makes sense
that
to me. Really touches you deeply and tells you why we do this, right? Like that stories are the currency of the soul, and like playing these games, we're making them together, and that's a powerful thing for humans. So
it's something that I try to talk about a lot, which is just how unique it is. That yes, we call it tabletop gaming, right? And tabletop gaming covers a lot of things, but God damn it, RPGs are different. Yeah. Role-playing games are different. I've got a whole dissertation argument that I've put out there, piece by piece in little podcasts, just saying it's the apex of gaming, in my opinion, for a lot of the things that you just talked about. So we've hinted at Band of Blades. So I want to take a quick break and I want to talk about it because as many surprising changes that I saw in my mind from Scum and Villainy. I expected it to be a clone and it wasn't. And I was delighted when I felt like I was forensic, going through and going, ooh, this was different. This has changed. Band of Blades shocked me. And that was the second game that I bought a year. So let's talk about that when we come back. This is the part of many podcasts where someone comes on, interrupts the show, and explains that you should consider paying for the content that you're listening to right now for free. That pitchman explains by giving $1 or more a month, you not only support the show, but you allow the show to grow and improve. Here on the third floor, we refuse to interrupt your episode of Tabletop Talk with such time-wasting pleas. We pledge never to run a spot asking you to go to patreon.com and give $1 or more a month because supporting content creators keeps the content coming. Even if there is a link in the show's description, and there is, we don't ask you to click it and become a patron. We don't waste time rambling about the benefits like early access to episodes, getting episodes without ad breaks like this, or even getting a chance to play in one of Craig's RPG sessions. Anyway, enjoy this episode knowing Tabletop Talk, despite being supported by its patrons, won't engage in such blatant appeals for support. So I came across both titles at the same time, and it's because I wasn't in I played role-playing young, took 20 years off for role-playing for various reasons, came back to role-playing about 2 years ago. So a lot of this stuff had already been baked, but it was all brand new to me, right? So for me, Band of Blades and Scum and Villainy and Blades in the Dark all come to my face at the exact same time. And I grab Blades, and I'm like, I really freaking like this. And then I go, that means I got to go get this one. And I pick up Scum and Villainy, and I'm like, I really like this too. And then I got Band of Blades, and I liked it, but it surprised me. So let's take a step back. Was Scum and Villainy done and then Blades, or is there some overlap?
No, it was done. Scum and Villainy was out the door before we started working on Band of Blades.
Okay, so if we were to find the initial seed of you playing FFG's Game of Thrones, I don't know what you'd be playing that would have inspired it. What's the origin story on Band of Blades?
So one of the things that I've noticed about myself is that this is actually really interesting. I learned about myself by designing this game. I've always liked a little horror mixed into my fantasy, a little bit of dark fantasy, if you will. And it's something that has always piqued my interest. I honestly, if you asked me about it, I would said like, well, maybe it's because I started with Warhammer, but it's not true. It's kind of been a running thing. And so one of the things that I discovered in the process of making it is that growing up, the fairy tales that I grew up with are full of blood and some very dark things. And it's sort of where I come from, as part of my childhood. So my fantasy tends to be tinged with a lot of that. And so I think what it was is I told John actually that I wanted to make a kind of like a fantasy-ish version of Blades. And one of the things that John does is he is very good at breaking down the core conceit of why we're making a game. Like, what is this game about? Why would you play this and not... and the question here is, why Band of Blades and not generic fantasy X or dark fantasy Y? Why play Band of Blades and not Shadow of the Demon Lord or whatever? And the answer is because it's not... There's this lie that you need one game for everything, or you could use one game for everything. I think that, but I do think that you should probably think about whenever you play a game, why are we playing this game and not another one? And one of the things that this forced me to do is to break down what about this genre I was really interested in, and sort of what thematic elements and things I want to pull on, and why is this different than other examples? So one of the things that I talked about is that Band of Blades has this World War II experience, but it's much more European. Yep. There is a difference between reading something in a historical document, or like watching a movie, and like walking down the street, skipping as a kid, dragging your hand across a wall, feeling 40mm shells still embedded in it. So it's one of those things. And so like Band of Blades is not the heroic hoorah, we just get together and, we're fighting, we're the good guys.
The Lich Lord or whatever.
Exactly. Yeah. And so like one of the conceits of the game that it starts with is, it says that you lost before you even begin, right?
Which is so cool.
And so what you're doing is you're playing this frantic retreat, which is actually based on a historic thing that happened. And so the other thing that we really kind of brought to it is John was a military brat. And so like he brings like we talked a lot about like how to convey this feeling of being part of something larger and having to trust forces, and maybe technology. In our case, it's magic, right? Like Chosen, but like things that you don't even perfectly understand, but you need them to work and you desperately want them to work, but they're not 100% reliable. And so like a lot of Band of Blades is just us exploring some of these themes that maybe we don't see in other games and trying to like fine tune it to a very specific experience. And before we began, we sat down and we talked to each other. And one of the things that we agreed on is that this game was going to hopefully be very powerful for the people that it was designed for, but it was definitely not going to be a game for everyone.
Right.
And you see that a lot, actually. Some of the feedback is a lot of people are like, well, my players really don't like it when a lot of their comrades die. And I'm like, I understand it's not supposed to feel good. I'm sorry, but and they're like, well, what if we just don't do that? And I'm like, well, that's fine, but you're not playing this game then. And so like it's totally okay. There are other ones. I have some suggestions, but like maybe this is not the game for you. That's all
and that's okay.
And that's okay. Yes. And so yeah, I don't think that everybody needs to play my games, but I definitely, a Band of Blades definitely has like a bit more of a statement to make. And I think that it's a lot less like center of the Hollywood sort of experience. And so, yeah, I remember specifically we were in a restaurant, we were eating noodles, and we were talking about what makes this brand of fantasy different than every other brand of fantasy. Like it started as a joke, you know, like, hey, if you were to make a Blades fantasy game, what would you want to do?
That was going to be my question, and you've answered it already, which is what was first, the war theme or fantasy? And it sounds like fantasy was the first, or was it all at the same time?
Fantasy was first, and I think that it was really funny because we sat there and we talked. It was supposed to be like 45-minute, 1 hour lunch or whatever, and we ended up talking for like 3 or 4 hours, and then I wrote a pitch for it, and then I sent it to Harper for the Kickstarter, and that got added as a stretch goal. But we talked about it until we had like the tone, and we understood like some of the like core pieces of it. But yeah, it started out as kind of like a joke, like, hey, you know, like let's do some fantasy. And I was like, yeah, but if I'm doing fantasy, it's probably going to be dark fantasy. And so like we talked about like, what does that mean? What are we trying to get across? And the whole like military theme, the idea that you're just specifically a military unit. Actually, I think we had hashed it out on that first day. Now that I think about it, if you read the blurb on the Kickstarter, I think it's still there. But yeah, that was definitely the second component. I think the first component was 100%. Let's just have some dark fantasy. And then what we decided is that we didn't want to do like dark fantasy heroes, and so like we made it very, very specific. So
yeah. I'd be curious, when you're creating a Forged in the Dark game, is there and I would have no idea what this process is like, which is where this question is coming from. Do you say this is the shell, right? These are things that make it Forged in the Dark.
Yep.
Here's my ideas. How do I slot that in with crew versus starship, right? Like I'm trying to understand that process, and I have no idea what that would be like.
So the first thing that we do, so I 100% don't want to put words in anyone's mouth, and I don't want to pretend that I know the secrets of all Forged in the Dark things, and therefore this statement is 100% true. But I've actually done speeches on like, what does Forged in the Dark mean, in my opinion? Yeah. And John and I have played a lot of different versions, and we've tested a lot of things, and there's a couple of things that I think are key to it. The idea of position and effect, the idea that what you do in the fiction affects the mechanics, was the initial seed that created the system. And I think that if you take it out, it stops feeling like Blades.
I agree.
There's a bunch of other things, like stress gets converted into pushes and resistances. The idea that as a character, you can say, I'm going to go all in. It has kind of like a little bit of like a gambling feel where you put everything on the line and you push. Like that's definitely a thing that when we took out, it stopped feeling like Blades. And I think that resistance is the ability to say no. The GM says like this horrible thing happens, and then you just put your hands down and you're like, no, I'm going to resist that, and this is how it's going to happen. That is very Blades. Gotcha. So like those are kind of like core conceits. And then after that, there's a bunch of things that I think are, I'm not going to call them optional, but what I'm going to say is that you need to consider what the purpose of it is in the game, and then decide if it fits in your game. So like Harper in Blades in the Dark makes a city that has electro barriers and a toxic, non-survivable environment outside it. So in a modern day Thief setting, after you perform a heist, you execute the getaway, and then you leave the city and you lay low somewhere else, which is something that we implemented in Scum and Villainy with the systems and whatnot. But like in Blades, you can't. And part of the reason is because he wants you, every time you make a move, for the world to resist it and make a counter move, right? Like if you take turf, that was somebody's, and now they're angry. And so that's going to create story. And so if you want to make a game that doesn't have turf, that's fine, but you need to consider what generates that push. Like how does the world react to the players so that it doesn't feel static and the players aren't like superheroes acting and the world is only reacting. Like the world actually pushes back, and what makes that happen. And so taking apart all of the pieces and testing it, you have to like hold it up almost like a glass in front of a light and like look for the fingerprints and see like, okay, does this fit? How do we put this in? What does this look like? And so there's a lot of things that go into this. We're going to talk about games and inspiration. I believe a few weeks before that conversation, somebody had literally said that it's impossible to hack Blades because the structure is so strong that nobody could actually bust out of the original format. And I went, really? And so, of course,
Noted.
Well, I don't take this as like a personal grievance. I look at it as discussions. Notable physicists used to do these thought experiments. They would have salons and somebody would say like, I think this is impossible. And then somebody would propose an experiment that would prove or disprove it. And I think that a lot of times when I hear an argument like that, what I think to myself is, but how would I do that? How can I prove that this is doable? And this came from one of those thought exercises. The other thing is that there is one of the things we discovered. So talking about just giving context to your viewers, if you play Band of Blades, there is these meta roles where you play like the quartermaster, the commander, and so on, like these larger than life roles in the army that are also responsible for like making the sort of downtimes function.
Right.
And so one of the things that we realized is that it's actually really hard to GM Band of Blades. And so I don't think that round robin GMing is a solution for most GM-less things. So one of the things that we did was, in order to demonstrate a solution, I think I think I was the instigator of this, but like both of us definitely worked on actually making it come real. But we fractured a lot of the jobs of the GM so that the GM didn't have to micromanage the game. The players would actually be given, and it's written in very military language. So it says like, these are your duties, right? Mm-hmm. And so you have the things that you're supposed to do during downtimes to make the game function. So in other Blades games, you know, you have the GM who's basically like overseeing the process of downtime and making sure that everyone's doing the actions that they're supposed to and whatnot. Whereas here, that's actually been distributed to the players, and the GM has a very specific role, which is like rolling up the missions and running them and keeping the tone consistent, all this other stuff. So like, it's a way of distributing responsibilities and telling the players that they're responsible for running certain portions of the game, and then like couching it in this very playful kind of like, these are your duties language, which both reinforces the thematic elements and also like gives us a clear, easy context in which we can kind of teach it. So,
well, you're telling people how to play the game, which is super important.
So yeah, but you were mentioning that there's a lot of departures. How do you do it? I think it's just some of it. The first time you try it, there's a lot of try and fail. You try a piece and it doesn't work out. You change it. You see if it works or doesn't. The more you do this with a similar system, the more quickly you can anticipate what the outcomes of certain changes are.
Right.
And so most people aren't going to see very, very, very early drafts. The moment you mention you're working on a game, someone's like, cool, why don't you send it to me tomorrow? And you're like, whoa, okay, no. But
it's 4 sentences.
Yeah, sometimes it's like, did I mention it's written on napkins? I actually, when I first met John Harper and he mentioned that he would make a game in a weekend, it kind of blew my mind. Like, I couldn't comprehend it. It was mind-boggling. But
he didn't tell you it was a shitty game. He just said he made it.
No, actually, they're pretty playable. I've played some of them. They're real good, actually.
Making a joke. Yeah, no, making a joke.
But the thing is that as I've gotten better at layout, and a lot of people are like, oh, you're so good at this. I'm like, well, I've been doing it like almost every week for like 5 years. I hope I got a little better. So like now that I'm a lot more fluid in speed, I can actually make a character sheet like in a weekend as well, and I'll just
that's awesome.
Play test something with people. So like somebody will say like, hey, I'm moving next week, and I'm like, cool, do we want to play a game? All right, I'll make us something, and next week we're playing. And so
is that muscle memory? Is that just practice?
Yeah, it's just practice. It's just speed. It's definitely like a lot of people are like, oh, it's talent. No, it's literally just practice.
Yeah.
When I started, it took me 2.5 months to make the Scum and Villainy sheet. It took me 4 weeks to make the Band of Blades sheet. Yep. And most of the other sheets I make are in sub 1 hour now. And so like even really complex sheets that I'm iterating on multiple times will not take more than a day per iteration. So it's just practice. It's just time spent understanding your toolkit, knowing how to apply it quickly. And I mean, that's just, sometimes games have this like thing that you've wanted to do forever, and then you do it. And sometimes games are just, I don't know, so I'm working on a game called Spell and Blade, and it literally happened because the pandemic started, and my group was like, we just watched The Witcher, and we kind of want to play a weird fantasy-ish game. What do you think? And we had a first draft by next week, and that's how that got started. So sometimes it's just it starts out as a joke, and everybody knows not to like look at it too closely. But then if we're having fun, then we revise it, and we revise it some more, and then eventually it becomes a thing. So,
well, and this is where I'm going to pull back your playtesting experience, because you have experience identifying that fun and realizing what's causing it, right? And that's got to make you go, hey, there's something else here.
Yeah, that's definitely a thing. There's occasionally times when, you do something as a joke and you never expect to show it to anyone. It's like something for your home group that you've played like once. Yeah. And then like it kind of sticks with you. And then occasionally like and I know, because like John and I definitely have this phrase where we look at each other and I'm like, I think there's something here. I think this has got legs. And so and he said the same thing to me about, games before. So like, yeah, it's a thing. It's like, you definitely zero in it. So yeah. Band of Blades was a bit more of a obvious departure. I think that Scum and Villainy has a lot of subtle departures from Blades. There are certain things that seem like they're really small changes, like the Gambit, which is a thing that you get on risky rolls that actually changes the tone of the game entirely. Yep. But if you don't call out why you're doing a specific thing, or you don't make a big deal of it, sometimes it's easy to just be like, I don't know, it's just, sometimes you make a die. That doesn't seem like a big deal, but it really does make a huge difference.
Well, and it's fun to find that. I find it fun to find that. Things that I didn't think would be a big deal. And then you go, well, wow, that is a big deal.
The first time I read game design.
I mean, the first time I read Blades in the Dark, like literally the first time I digested it, I'm like, position effect, whatever. Right? Like keep going. And then, I don't know, an hour in running my first game, I'm like, holy shit, like this is everything. Like I never seen anything like before. And the same thing happens, with Scum and Villainy. You're like, okay, all right, yeah. You start flexing it and you're like, oh shit, like this does change things. This is a big deal. And that's very, very interesting. So one of the questions I often ask is, when you're going through the iterations, what was the big breakthrough? What was the big the big click moment? I'm going to do something a little bit different here with this game. Can you remember a change you made that you either quickly or it hung around for a little while, went, this is garbage and it has to go? So what was one? Can you remember something big that you threw out?
Yeah, I'll tell you. The map. We'll talk about that for 1 second.
Please.
But like before I get to it, when I say certain things, this isn't like bragging. It's just that big changes tend to you understand usually before you even, like, the more you make games, particularly in the same system, the faster you'll understand that something's not going to work.
Right.
So it's like it's experience. So a lot of when I say like, well, there wasn't a ton of that in Band of Blades, people are like, did you try different stuff? It's like, well, we thought about stuff and we postulated to each other and maybe we rolled a couple of dice to see if it would work. And when it didn't, we backed away from it. But that was before it even hit the table.
That's the practice piece. Yeah.
That's the practice piece. Yeah. But one of the things that we goofed around for a while is we kept trying to figure out how to make the travel to Skydagger Keep work. And what we settled on finally is something called a point crawl, where there are branching choices, but you go from location to location. But previous to that, one of the things that we did was we actually had a hex map where you would calculate, like, there was like costs of movement. You would roll to get how much you could move, and then you could like cut through the grasslands or like try and hire a boat and all this other stuff. And what we actually discovered was that, so first off, for those of you that don't know, I accepted this from John Harper. One of the things that I realized is that the fastest way to get a game into someone's hands and playing is if you make some sheets. And one of the things that forces you to do is you have to write your rules incredibly clearly and incredibly concisely. So there's a lot of times where people are like, well, why don't you just write it like this? And I'm like, because it won't fit on a page. And that's the thing that's really hard for some people to understand, because like that's a consideration I have to keep in mind, because I can't hand a book to someone and expect them to play within a half hour, I hand them usually a character sheet or a handout, and, you know, they have like 2 or 3, and that's all they're expected to digest before they play. And so one of the things that we discovered is that these hex movement rules like ate up an immense amount of space. But after testing it extensively, what we discovered was that it took the same number of turns to get the Sky Dagger. So,
isn't that funny?
So there wasn't really a major advantage other than you could decide to do some sort of weird maneuver and cut through the fields. And like we had like different encounters for fields versus cities or whatever. And so like you could only get like special missions in locations. So people ended up going to the locations anyway. And so like it was just one of those things. Like we tried it and we thought that it was like going to be really interesting and provide this like flanking or hiding kind of it didn't work. And so like that went out the window, and we settled on the kind of like location to location travel with like a single roll to signify like how many resources it eats up.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Very revealing. Very, very revealing. So guys, we're going to take one more break. When we get back from this break, we're going to talk about something a little bit more recent. We're going to talk about some of the games that followed, the 2 games that we talked about. And I want to kind of bug you a little bit and find out what you think about the industry today. We'll be right back. Gadzooks Gaming is one of our favorite places online to get your gaming goodies. Terrain, base inserts, miniature games like Marvel Crisis Protocol and Malifaux, jewelry, and even hand-carved wands. RPG books for Call of Cthulhu and Dungeons & Dragons, accessories and models to make your RPG session next level. They are veteran-owned and operated and help support us. So go to gadzooksgaming.com and check out all of their gaming gold. Be sure to tell them Craig from the 3rd floor sent you. That's gadzooksgaming.com. So sometimes I feel bad when I reach out to designers and developers because I'll give you an example. Reach out to Steve Jackson. Say, you know, Steve, I'd love for you to come on the show. And like an idiot, he said yes. And I wanted to talk about GURPS, right? Because GURPS was like, for me, it was my D&D, right? Years of my childhood spent grokking GURPS. The last frickin' thing Steve Jackson wants to talk about is GURPS. And I can't blame the guy, right? And it, you know, and at one point in the pre-interview when he and I were just kind of chatting, I said, you know, because I kind of knew this already. I'd already talked to some other people, and I said, I do have GURPS in the outline. He goes, I see it. And I said, I just want to talk a little bit about it. But I understand, like, you don't want to hold on to it. He goes, Craig, I've talked to all I'm going to talk about it. And he goes,
talked it to death.
Yeah. And he goes, he goes, one Google search and you can find hours of me talking about it. And I'm like, that's fair. And I feel that a little bit with you too, right? So these are games that, you know, that you've made and they're closed. So the reason all of that really overly long introduction is, what are you excited about? What have you put out recently? What are you working on now? What do you want to talk about?
Well, so this is interesting. Working on a book, as I mentioned, is kind of it's an act of stamina. And because you're working to a deadline, right? Like the book has to go to print and you want to have a book finished so that it can get sold at Gen Con or whatever. It also means that a lot of times that's the only thing you're working on for a while. And everybody deals with that pressure a little bit differently. I know that after we're done with the book, the first thing that John does is take like 4 weeks off to just like chill. And that's totally understandable. And I have absolutely no, a judgment on that. But because I'm not allowing my brain to design other games, usually what happens is the moment I come out of a book, I make like 2 or 3 small games. That's just how I do. And so frequently there's this absurdly crunched sprint as I put something out just to help release the pressure, as it were. And so I have a bunch of small games that came out. Some of them are not actually freshly designed, although they're redesigned. So I've worked a lot with Forged in the Dark, and one of the things that I haven't worked super extensively with is PBTA. I've played a lot of PBTA. I've play tested a lot of PBTA, but I put out a bunch of small games. You can find links to most of our games off of our Off-Guard game site, which I wish was super up to date, but truth be told, John and I look at it when we have to put something up for the most part. But one of the games that happened, I admire designers like Jason Morningstar greatly. And one of the things that I in particular admire about Jason is that he can find inspiration to make a game in almost anything. He'll watch a news snippet and he'll have a LARP about it by like that weekend. And for a while, I wondered if there was something weird about me because I didn't have the same reaction. Like, I'll watch a new snippet and I'll be like, well, that's a terrible thing that's happening, but I won't like make a game about it. And then a friend of mine, John Sheldon, he something was going on in his life and he was spending a lot of time in doctor's offices. And so he would stick 2 pens, one black and one orange, in his pocket, and he would just sketch in a sketchbook. And then he would post those pictures online. And they really spoke to me about those early days of gaming, like where you had very like second edition art, where it wasn't like the polished, full color painterly style that WotC seems to favor these days. And it was, I immediately knew the kind of game that I would make to go with it. And so like I reached out and I was like, hey, do you want a game to go with that art? And so, I made like this tiny little game called Into the Dark, which actually it's a 50 game in the sense that it still uses fictional positioning and whatnot, but it does it in a really weird way where it adds or removes dice. And so like that was just me experimenting with like reducing the size of a game and trying to make it smaller and smaller so that it's easier and easier to hack. And it's even got like little adventures in the back and whatnot. So that's the thing I made. There was a game that I made as a joke. It wasn't as a joke. It's Sean asked me to make a game. Well, actually, Sean asked me to GM a game for BBC, and it sold out. And I decided to make a custom game for the people there, and I actually did a Game Chef style thing where I let them pick verbs or to pick things that would be in the game, and they chose spycraft and supernatural and trust and all this. And so like I cooked up a game called Project Perseus, which was basically like spies versus the supernatural, and now that's becoming a thing. Like Sean's like, hey, you should actually make that a real book. So now we're doing that. So it's one of those things. It's like sometimes you just come out of this like pressure cooker. Like I know that a lot of people have coping strategies, but like certain things, like the way that I cope with certain things is I make games. So like I mentioned earlier, we went into the lockdown and I was only seeing my friends online. So of course, what I do, I made a game for us. So now I'm working on Spell and Blade. That's the thing that I'm excited about.
So a few times now, Stras, you said, it started off as a joke and then became a game. It started off as a joke and then made a game. I'm going to say this and you tell me if I'm wrong. I imagine there's been a lot of things that start off as a joke and they never became a game. Is that accurate?
Yes, okay. That is accurate.
Yeah. I don't want to give the impression that every time there's a joke near you, there ends up becoming a game. I
think that what it is that, here's the thing. I didn't realize it until this moment. Maybe my inspiration is just very different than Jason Morningstar. Maybe jokes are what fuels me. But you're laughing. I'm actually pretty serious. There's times when somebody says something and I make a game out of it. And I think that where I'm drawing the line is I think it always becomes a game. But I think that some of them become games that I share with other people. And so sometimes it's a game that is either personal or it only works in a specific context. And sometimes it's a game that's not like monetizable, like it's not productizable. It's a thing that is fun and is a thing that I love playing with my friends, but I don't know that it's going to get a broader reach, or maybe it needs a strange form factor. Like I was actually talking to John LaBeouf Little about Dogs in the Vineyard, and we were talking about how wildly different our experiences with the game were. And I mentioned that the context that I saw it in, like the context that I saw the game in most was a one shot at cons where it played more like an episode of the Supernatural in the Wild West or Weird West, I guess. And so John's like, well, that sounds like a more like, why doesn't somebody make that game? And so like literally a month after that, I ran that game for him. And it's not something I want to publish necessarily, but it's something that we made, and it was fun, and we had a good time with it. And then it went on the shelf.
So I'm going to pick your, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, no. Just as a point of note, I think that early on when you're a young designer, you think that ideas are everything. This ideation, like you're only ever going to have 2 or 3 great ideas, and you will only ever make 2 or 3 great games. And I think that there is some truth to the fact that, as I mentioned before, it takes a lot of effort to take a game to completion. And so what happens is that the amount of time that it takes to finish a product, to make a full-fledged book or whatever, eats up a lot of your life. And so what happens is that during that time, you'll have more ideas, sometimes because of jokes, sometimes because you find a specific mechanic. Sometimes there's a mechanic that doesn't work for this game, but it's going to work for your next game. And so you keep a folder of all of these ideas. And at any given time, the question that you're really asking is, what do I want to actually commit enough time to finish now? And so, yeah, there's a lot of joke ideas. And the thing is that some of them are jokes that I don't think will ever see the light of day. Maybe they just had like a flawed conceit, or there was some mechanic that didn't quite work out and you don't have time to fix it now. But maybe 6 years from now, you'll be in the shower and all of a sudden you'll have a flash of insight on how to fix it and it's good to go. And sometimes it's just, it's the idea that, yeah, this is a cool idea, but it's not something that I want to work on right now. I want to work on this other thing. And sometimes it's not even your choice. Sometimes you ask your producer and you're like, hey, Sean Ninner, I have these 3 things I want to do. Which of these do you think Evil Hat would be most interested in? And, Sean will say, that one I think will probably sell the best, so please work on that one. And you're like, okay. And like, you should never pick something that you don't actually want to work on. But like, if you do have a list, then, that can help you sort of figure out like, well, if this one's going to get published and these other ones are not, then clearly work on that one. So, yeah, it's just, sometimes it's a joke and it stays a joke. Sometimes it's a game that is going to have legs. It's just not going to have legs today. So
I'm trying to figure out how to formulate this question. And if I flop, you're just going to say, Craig, I have no idea what the hell you're asking me. I'm trying to figure out this response language that I'm picking up in the patterns of the stories you're telling me, where I read this and somebody said it's impossible, and I respond with a game. Yeah. Someone makes a joke, and I go, well, let's try that next week. There's lockdown, so I'm going to make a game. Can you help me understand what's going on there? Is it a language? Is it how you communicate? Is it a response? Is it just you love making games? Like, what's driving that? Or have I picked up on a pattern that doesn't exist?
I can't stop making games is the problem. I've tried. It just there was I had a couple of rough weeks, and I was like, I don't know if I'm ever gonna make more games right now. And then of course somebody said something about, hey, we just watched this, maybe we can play next week. And then of course I made it. So I think it's one of those things is like I keep making games, and also my brain has these leaps of intuition. Like when somebody says like, I don't think this can be done, I can kind of half see the pattern, or maybe I just have the answer. And then instead of writing a rant on the internet, I just make a game that lets a person test it and see exactly how I'm kind of envisioning it working.
Right.
It's not, I definitely think there is a pattern there. It's just like, it's like a teacher, saying something in class and you're like, oh, I know the answer to this one. But like, I think that games are, we talked about this earlier, right? Games are a powerful thing. And so I think that it is, instead of arguing with someone or telling someone that they're wrong or being mean to someone, I think that it's more fruitful to add to the conversation by producing something. Mm-hmm. Like make the world a bigger place, make it a small game that maybe is never going to become a book. So like put it out there, CCBY, let people hack it. So if somebody says like, hey, this can't be done, and then you put out a small game and you're like, hey, please, use this game to make more games. That's absolutely a thing I want to do. Like I believe in my community. I could not have made any of these games without the work that came before them. Obviously we see that PBTA is the core touchstone that, Blades is built from, and my games are built from Blades, and trying to extend some of the systems and play with them there. And so without the generous, work and also the giving away of the rights to continue that work, some of these people have done stuff like this. So I feel like it's my responsibility to contribute instead of just yell on the internet, which doesn't go anywhere. So like, it's one of those things, like produce something, put it out there. It might get noticed, it might not, but like, you know, it adds to the conversation and gives people some Lego blocks, because who knows, sometimes you know, you put out a game and you don't expect anything to happen, and then, you know, you get an email a couple years down the road and someone's like, hey, I made this thing out of this, or like, hey, can I publish this thing that uses this mechanic? And you're like, yeah, sure, that's great, I'm excited. So
one of the things that's been really cool about having this podcast and me deciding that I'm going to ask everybody who's made a game that I like to see if they come on the show, and you know, oddly nobody said no. But what it's allowing me to do, because like I mentioned, there was a huge gap in me playing, and I just came back and like the whole freaking place changed, right? Everybody changed games and they didn't ask me about it. And I've been trying to piece it together. And so another thing I'm picking up on, and again, tell me if I'm barking up the wrong tree here, between talking to the bakers, talking to Ron about, you know, the kind of the culture of the Forge. And one of the things that I'm picking up on is that was a language that somebody would say something in the context of the Forge and people would respond with a game. They would say, I think you're wrong. And you know, I think it was Vincent that said this. He was just like, don't tell me I'm wrong. Show me I'm wrong. And I'm wondering if that built up a culture of something, or was it that people, that's how they communicated anyway, and they just happened to come together there? Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think that that's a practice that has existed in many different, like, I don't want to say subcultures, but what I mean is like you get, like I said, the salons of the physicists and how they did the physics thought experiments. Art critique oftentimes can actually be done similarly, where somebody makes a painting with a new style that shows a new perception or a new way to do a thing. And so I think there are definitely communities that do that, and I think that the Forge happened, and I happen to be the kind of scientist that always admired this, and I think that I'm too young. I missed the Forge. I wasn't part of that community. I can't claim credit. I'm actually way younger in the indie scene than most people think. And so, but a lot of my mentors, a lot of the people that I admire, a lot of the people that talk about stuff, would do things like this. And, you know, you would see people who would do thought experiments, like Epidia would make a game that would fit on a business card. And that's a thing that he did, and that inspired an entire like micro game genre. And so like, I think what it is just that I sort of looked at the road tread before me, and I found that this worked for me. It's not necessarily going to work for everyone. I'm also an academic. So to me, one of the things that I did was my homework. So I actually went back and read a lot of the Forge essays, and I read a lot of the posts and things like that. You know, you go through the Lumply blog and everything. So I think that some of it's just stuff that I accepted or absorbed as part of me, and some of it just comes to me naturally from these other communities that I'm a part of. I don't know that everyone's gonna be able to do that.
It's not going to make sense to everybody, right?
Exactly.
It made sense to you.
And so like, this is a thing that I've adopted. It's also a thing that I encourage people to do, because I think that making a thing forces you to think about a thing, and typing an angry blog post, oftentimes you regret it. So you shouldn't. But it's one of those things where like making a thing will teach you about it. Even if it teaches you like what doesn't work about it, that's still a lesson you're learning. And so the process of making this thing and putting it out there and seeing what people do with it, I think is a powerful one, because it helps you, even if it helps nobody else, but hopefully it'll help other people as well. And so, so it's a thing that I espouse. It's a thing that I encourage people to do, but I also respect the fact that, you know, some people are desperately trying to have a game design career, but also juggling a kid and work and other stuff. And maybe not everyone can just make a game in a weekend. And so like, I'm not judging anyone out there. It's just, this is me. This is the community that I kind of learned from, and it is what works for me. It
works for you, and I think that's a big takeaway. So back in '92, when I played my last game of role playing before I took my huge break, don't laugh at me. I'm not that.
I am not laughing.
You are laughing. Everybody listening right now, literally trying not to burst out laughing when I said '92, and then 7 years later I was born. I come back and the world has completely changed, right? Before you had to have a password to figure out if somebody else liked D&D, and then you'd meet under the underpass and maybe we'd play. Now everybody's like, yeah, I love role playing. Have you watched Critical Role? Like, I can mention it at a dinner party and I'm not going to get looked at. Everything has changed. And I'd be curious, two things to keep it short, because we could do a whole podcast on the current state. What is exciting to you about where we are now in the hobby, and what scares you?
One of the things that's really exciting is that we're kind of in a golden age of role-playing games. We're seeing a lot of small games. We're seeing people pushing the envelope with what constitutes a game. We're seeing people pushing the envelope with trying all sorts of weird and different rules. So I think that what's exciting is the fact that the game I'm most excited about is probably one that I haven't even seen yet. Because every year I see new stuff that's absolutely brilliant and doing some cool stuff. And every year I still find games that I'm absolutely hyped to get to the table, absolutely, thrilled to give a spin. And some of them work out, some of them don't, but that's like the normal process. But I think that's the thing that's like super exciting about the hobby. And actually, I think that there are shifts happening that I think we're not even understanding, because like it's one of those things where when it first started out, there were these like magazines that you needed to have a secret know-how to even sign up for one to get one.
I remember those times.
And then like right, and so like, and now we're talking about that transition, right? Like where initially you could never meet a designer, then conventions happened, then you could maybe meet a designer in person, so somebody could be sent out as an emissary, and then like after that, it came to like, wait, now you can just email any designer and they'll probably respond. And then it got to the point where it's like, wait, you can chat with them in real time. And there was this transition that I think we're still, now it's becoming mainstream, but I think that it took a little while. Like you'll still find a bunch of designers who will write big blog posts about like, does Twitch even really matter? And I'm like, whoa, you are a dinosaur, friend.
You got some catching up to do.
Hint, it's bigger than you think.
Yeah.
So it's one of those things where Twitch went from this curiosity that popped up to, well, maybe we can roleplay on it, to Critical Role now has a cartoon on Amazon, right? And so one of the things that I think is happening is this shift, and I'm really curious about seeing, does the 300-pound gorilla, aka D&D, like get dethroned by like a game? Because like we see this is the thing that I fear. This is where I'm landing on the fear. Ready? Is that people oftentimes confuse monetary success with quality. So now that role playing has become mainstream, and we've kind of won the culture war where you're no longer like made fun of for role playing, you start seeing some of the negative connotations of that, right? So like how Wendy's became one of the most played RPGs ever in a weekend because they gave some kind of pitiful sum of money to an advertising agency that put out something that's kind of like a role-playing game. And it's one of those things where like we are starting to see corporatization, and I mean, some of the biggest games that are out there right now are written not by the most brilliant game designers, but by really good marketers. And so like now we're being exposed to all of the market forces that actually influence a lot of things. And so this niche hobby that was really about these beautiful stories and these thought experiments is becoming a lot more mainstream, but that also comes with its own costs, right? Where like the noise of the mainstream will drown out things. And there's some people trying to make an effort. I know that for all the flack that he sometimes catches, like Mercer is trying to run indie games now and again and help out some lesser known designers and things like that. And I know from just like looking at some numbers that people publish, like I know that Roll20 publishes like things. So like when Mercer ran Call of Cthulhu, like all of a sudden the numbers like went up by orders of, but like millions of games created. And so like this is one of those things. I think that the next big hurdle is sort of us figuring out how to get the games that people will love into the hands of the people that don't even know they exist. And so it's an interesting time in the hobby. And I think that staying flexible and looking at how things are shifting is kind of mandatory, and a lot of, well, is this even really going to be a thing, is sometimes a foolish question to ask.
Yeah, so. I think that ship sailed. You know, and the same thing of like, you know, does Twitch even matter? Really, that made me laugh. But you are seeing, so I agree with you, but like seeing like the Glass Cannon stop playing Pathfinder, and they just put out Mork Borg episode 3. I mean, that's a sign, right? In my mind that you know, it may not, I don't know. I have no idea what's going to happen, but I find it interesting that we're starting to see, you know, kids on bikes being played by some of the bigger, you know, just like people are starting to pick up this stuff.
I'm laughing because I'm working on a project with Spencer Stark, so it's kind of cool to hear a plug for kids. Yeah.
I'm gonna have to bug
it's
you.
It's called Young Blades. You can call me back later for it.
I'm gonna bug you for a handshake. You shouldn't have said that out loud.
It's all good. It's all good.
So I think it's fascinating, but I think the scary, I think, is a very legitimate one, a very, very legitimate one. And I've been getting tangled up in the is D&D ruining the industry conversations on Twitter, and I do my very, very best to stay out of it, because I don't think it's a simple answer to that at all. But I think the points that you made are very important about that. Holy crap! What a good time. I was really looking forward to this because I'm a fan, and this was a great interview, and I just cannot thank you enough for taking the time. Oh,
hey, it's my pleasure. It's actually really interesting because I haven't actually been on all that many podcasts. It's one of those things, I think, like right before our games go out, Sean shouts a few things, but like a lot of the podcasts that I do listen to, I have not been on. And so like, it's super interesting to me, like kind of, this was actually super comfortable. I'm
glad.
Sat down and sort of chatted about the state of gaming and ages with anyone. So it's kind of awesome.
See, with some little shitty podcast send you an email that you've never heard of, sometimes you just got to say yes. It may not be too bad.
I mean, John Harper was on the show. I don't know if the episode's out yet or whatever, but he spoke very well of you, which I've mentioned. So like, I don't know about that. I definitely got preamble and people praising you long before I actually showed up here. So
very, very kind. Thank you. All right. So we're going to have a link, obviously, to the untended website that you mentioned. But if somebody wants to get more of Stras, where else can they go?
You can find me on Twitter at Stras A. I'm sure it'll be linked in the. It will all in the show notes. Yeah. But yeah, that's usually a good place to catch me on the internet. I used to stream a lot on twitch.tv/actualplay. I haven't been on there as much lately because I'm working on a book, which, as aforementioned, eats up a lot of time. But I will be back, obviously, running and playing games. That's the majority of places you can find me. Beautiful. Well, like I said, Stras, I really appreciate it. And for those of you that stuck around all the way to the end, I appreciate you too. Thanks for listening. Take care.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. Subscribe to Tabletop Talk and share it with your friends. Check out our content on YouTube and Twitch. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook and stay updated on everything coming from Third Floor. All the links are in the show notes. Take care, floorheads.
Hey, are you still here? Wow. Well, the episode is over, but if you're bored, why not go to patreon.com and support the show for as little as $1 a month? Yeah, you can just scroll down and get the link. It's Patreon that makes this and all of our other content possible. Don't you want to join the other floorheads on the Patreon Discord? Anyway, thanks for sticking around. Take care.